So earlier this week, this comedian, Tony Hinchcliffe, made an offensive joke on stage at a Trump rally. Trump distanced himself from Tony, but then something else happened. Mark Maron, the comedian, he called for some soul searching about comedy. The group chat is here. We have a lot to get into. Let's go. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Okay, look, you might have seen the story on the news earlier this week. Tony Hinchcliffe, he's a popular comedian. He's a friend of Joe Rogan's. He's mostly known for offensive jokes. He was speaking at a Trump rally, and then this rally, look, it's a big deal. It was kind of billed as a big deal. It was in Madison Square Garden, okay? And Tony made a whole bunch of disparaging jokes on stage, but one in particular got a big reaction on social media.
There's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Oof. Both Republicans and Democrats called Hinchcliffe's jokes racist. And then this story just kind of kept going. Biden has waded in. He appeared to call Trump supporters garbage. And now I'm seeing pictures of Trump himself in my social feed in a garbage truck. While also we've seen this interesting development where Donald Trump has distanced himself from Tony Hinchcliffe. So that's the political sideshow. But what I want to talk about is what this says about comedy right now. Because this week, the comedian Mark Maron posted this letter on his website that really got my attention. He didn't name Tony Hinchcliffe exactly, but he called out a darker trend he's seeing in comedy right now. He said, quote, "The anti-woke flank of the new fascism is being driven almost exclusively by comics, my peers," unquote. So to talk about this moment, and the group chat is here. Raquel Reichard is a deputy director for Refinery 29 Somos, and Hershal Pandya covers comedy for Vulture. Hershal and Raquel, welcome to the show, y'all. How's it going?
Hello, hello.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Oh my God, it's a delight to have you. Hershal, I'm going to start with you. We've talked about Tony Hinchcliffe and his incredibly popular podcast, Kill Tony, on the show before. This appearance at a Trump rally over the weekend was his, let's say, hard launch into the mainstream in a way. Of all comedians that Trump could have picked, why do you think he picked Tony?
Yeah, so over the past few weeks or so, Trump has been aggressively courting a specific voter demo, which we'll call the male podcast listener demo. And to an extent, he's succeeded, right? He's hit a lot of the major tent poles for where these people tune into, right? He went on the Joe Rogan Experience. He went on this past weekend with Theo Vaughn. He went on Flagrant with Andrew Schultz. But the one podcast he didn't go on was Kill Tony. So I guess his campaign figured, why not do the next best thing? Let's get him into our rally, right? But the thing with a lot of these podcasts is they tend to liken themselves as sort of like nonpartisan free thinker types, right? Yeah. The types who wouldn't go to a rally and support one political candidate over another, because that's something the sheep would do, right? But Tony Hinchcliffe isn't so bothered by that idea, right? He's been vocally supporting Trump for at least since as far back as 2017. He's been doing pro-Trump material on stage, and he likes to play the heel. Like, that's something he's talked about. Like, he likes the wrestling archetype of the heel. And on top
of that,
the bad
guy in the room. He wants to be the bad guy in the room.
Precisely, yeah. And on top of that, he's had a good year. I mean, he was on the roast of Tom Brady earlier this year on Netflix, and he did incredibly well on that. His podcast sold out Madison Square Garden just for 2 nights just a couple months ago. Yeah. So you can just imagine the Trump campaign looking at the stats and being like, oh yeah, this guy talks to the audience we want to get to. Why not bring him into the fold? He'll do some roast jokes about Kamala and it'll be great. And then we saw what happened.
Can I just say, like, if you don't know who Joe Rogan is or Andrew Schultz is or Theo Vaughn is, I want to live on your internet. That sounds like a much nicer place to exist in. Raquel, Tony Hinchcliffe has had like a variety of racist jokes in this particular set, but the one that everyone is talking about is that joke we played off the top, the one about Puerto Rico earlier. What did you think when you first heard it?
I had a lot of different feelings, to be honest. Immediately, of course, I was angry, right? I'm a Puerto Rican woman. So hearing anyone, denigrate my ancestral land, our people, right, as garbage, because when you say Puerto Rico is made up of, when you're calling Puerto Rico a pile of garbage, you're calling its inhabitants garbage, right? You're calling us trash. And so, this is dehumanizing us in the same way that the United States has done historically, right? We are a colony, right, of the United States, and this language has been used for more than 100 years, right? So it was infuriating. So was the laughter, right? Like the joke got a lot of laughs. So it's clear this ideology runs very deep in this party. But the joke itself, I didn't actually think it was that funny. Like, it felt very random to me. It wasn't tied to a particular cultural moment, a news story, or anything. It wasn't good. It wasn't funny. Actually, what did have me laughing has been sort of seeing Trump, seeing his camp, seeing the Republican Party really try to distance themselves from the joke, right? And really the way in which they're doing that. So
What do you mean?
I saw a statement from the Republican National Hispanic Assembly that said that, these are not Trump's views. These are not the views of the Republican Party. We don't think about Puerto Ricans, and especially Puerto Ricans in Florida and Pennsylvania, this way. So, obviously 2 states with very sizable Puerto Rican populations.
Swing states,
yeah. 2 states that are swing states. So it all just feels like a bunch of phony baloney. And that did make me giggle.
Raquel, you're absolutely right. It is way funnier to be like, we apologize specifically to the Puerto Ricans in swing states than anything that Tony Hinchcliffe said on that stage. Hershal, I should say, like, as Raquel mentioned, they're like, Trump and his team are now distancing themselves from Tony Hinchcliffe, saying they didn't know what he was going to say. What do you make of that? What do you make of that reaction to Tony Hinchcliffe?
Well, are you implying that they would lie, Elamin?
I would I'm asking you. You're the comedy reporter among us.
The official party line, from what I read, is that, the campaign vetted his jokes ahead of time, but that he ad-libbed certain lines. So they said that he ad-libbed the line about Puerto Rico, the one about Latinos, and the one about Black people. And whether that's true or not, I can't say for sure. But what I do know is that when you hire Tony Hinchcliffe, you know what you're getting, right? Which is a comedian who steps on lines and then chastises people for being inevitably offended when he steps on those lines, right? And in doing so, he gets to position those people as like annoying moralists and scolds, while he gets to position himself as like cool and edgy and in support of freedom, right? Which is something that's like a lot of Republican identities wrapped up in this idea more recently, that like, oh yeah, this is our identity and we're being stepped on by these liberals and these woke people. I hate to use that word.
Yeah.
And so, I think in a sense that's what the campaign got from him, right? Like as Raquel mentioned, his jokes played fine in the room. It's only when they went online that people got mad. And then when they got mad, he got to do the thing. He got to point at them and say like, "Oh yeah, they just have no sense of humor," which is what he wrote on Twitter.
Can I just say what a laundry list that Hershal just laid out there, Raquel? Like, oh, he ad-libbed the one about Puerto Rico and the one about Black people and the one about the Latinos. Like, you would just hear that and go, "Why are you even? What kind of choice are you making here?" Can I ask you, Raquel? Does it matter if Trump's campaign has buyer's remorse about Tony Hinchcliffe now?
I don't think so. At least not for Puerto Ricans, right? I think that as the colonized people, right? I think we've been taught, most of us have been taught since our birth, right? That we are inferior, that we are second class, that we need the United States for our very survival. Right. This is what colonialism does, right? It is an inherently abusive and violent relationship. But I think for like the last decade, like something has been happening, and like there's been sort of this political awakening in Puerto Rico, and among Puerto Ricans both on the archipelago and in the States, that we are just kind of realizing or questioning: do we actually need this? Are we better off this way? Right? And I think this comes from the Fiscal Control Board and its failures, the abandonment that the island experienced after Hurricane Maria, right? The toppling of former Governor Ricky Rosselló. And so I think that there's a lot of people who are thinking or imagining that there can create a different autonomous reality. And so when it comes to Trump's buyer's remorse, and the sort of like distancing from this comedian, I think that the Puerto Rican community is seeing and really calling bullshit, because we have evidence now that this isn't just how this like camp thinks, but it's also how they have long operated politically in and towards Puerto Rico.
I want to zoom out for a moment, if we can, Hershal, and talk about this letter. Talk about this letter post that Mark Maron posted on his website, because he kind of talked about an interesting concept to me, which is the idea of comedians as the new sort of harbingers of fascism. And that's interesting. Like the idea that he's sort of connecting, saying, hey, what are we doing if comedy is being conscripted into the realm of introducing or making fascism more popular? What is it about the moment you think that we're in that comedians have so much influence right now?
I think it speaks to the growing influence of new media more than anything else, right? Because most of these comedians are podcasters. They have millions of loyal listeners who listen to them for hours each week, which gives them like outsized influence on these people, right?
Right.
And comedians by trade tend to be contrarians and they tend to be skeptics. And so what happens is, a bunch of people said Donald Trump is bad. And then some comedians were like, well, what if actually he's good?
Oh, I think I might have lost you there, Hershal. I think I might have lost. Damn, we were like in the middle of a really interesting point that Hershal was making there, and I think we've lost connection to him because something that we saw, Raquel, earlier this week is that like someone like Jon Stewart was kind of defending Tony Hinchcliffe, and it was interesting to me that that Jon Stewart was doing that. Like he said, he thinks that he's funny, and it's a reminder at least that for comedians, the main job is to be funny, regardless of how other people sort of maybe load it with meaning. And you can say, yeah, but that doesn't matter. But obviously it does anyway, because Tony like didn't appoint himself some kind of philosopher king. He did what he always does.
Right.
He's just like the stage that he was there. The stage was different. And the stage was much more charged. So if we take the thing that Hershal was saying right before we lost him there on the connection, how concerned do you think we should be that comedians are playing a much larger role, especially in how we talk about politics?
I mean, to be really honest, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that there was a time, right, when the political opinions of celebrities, right, comedians, celebrities at large, meant something, right? Like there was like this real material impact. So I don't know. I feel like I might disagree because I'm not sure if that's the case anymore, right? I think that these kinds of endorsements or comedic takes were effective at a time because they weren't the status quo. So it was like shocking. It was bold. But now it's really become the norm, right? Now you literally can't have a rally without a celebrity, whether it's like a D-list talent, like Tony Hinchcliffe, or like a megastar like, Beyonce, Taylor Swift. So I think for audiences or for voters, it perhaps maybe makes us like or dislike celebrities more or less, but I'm not sure how effective it is in like really changing the sort of hearts and minds of the people, especially at a time that's like the United States is really so divided. It's just such a polarizing moment in U.S.
Hershal, we have you back, and I'm glad we have you back. We got maybe like a couple of minutes left here. But I just want to talk about like that idea that Raquel was just mentioning, because there's something about celebrities that sometimes reinforce the thing that we already believe. And just before we lost you, what I was saying is that the very next night after that Tony Hinchcliffe clip went viral, you had someone like Jon Stewart come out on his show and defend Tony Hinchcliffe. And the thing that he said was, A, I think he's funny, and B, he reminded people that like for the comedians, the job is to be funny and everything else is sort of, a side show, if you will. And that seems to matter for someone like Jon Stewart. It does not seem to matter for Mark Maron, because Mark Maron is like, the outcome is you're still sort of supporting a movement that maybe should not be ushered in. What do you make of what Jon Stewart was saying there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something to be said for if Tony Hinchcliffe's joke was funnier, people would be less mad about it. I mean, it does suck that there is something to be said for that, but it's like, yeah, as Raquel mentioned, like it wasn't a well-crafted joke. Like it would just sounded like a sentence, honestly. It didn't sound like there was any like floating pile of garbage is very obvious imagery. It's not interesting. But like on top of everything else, like it speaks to the fact that Jon Stewart has a career where he has to be funny about politics constantly, right? Like it's in his best interest to put this point of view forward that like, yes, ultimately, like if I'm saying something off color about politics, like it is in the service of comedy.
I am interested in the fact that at least one outcome, Raquel, of all of this was Bad Bunny, J-Lo, and Ricky Martin, all artists with Puerto Rican roots. In the wake of this Tony Hinchcliffe joke, they're all like, okay, we're endorsing Kamala, we're jumping into here. So there's something to be said about that being a galvanizing moment, even if the Trump campaign didn't necessarily plan for it to be. Raquel and Hershal, I just want to say thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, anytime.
Take care.
Raquel Reichard is a deputy director of Refinery 29 Somos. She's based in Orlando, Florida. And Hershal Pandya covers comedy for Vulture magazine. He's in Toronto. I'm Elamin Abdul Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, horror films and books by Indigenous artists have been on the rise in recent years. I think here of Jeff Barnaby's film Blood Quantum or Gunadeo Horn's new movie Seeds. If you look at the best-selling books in the country, we often see books by Jessica Johns or Cherie Dimaline or my very next guest, Waub Rice. Waub, welcome, Pat. How's it going?
Good, Elamin. How you doing?
I'm great, man. It's nice to have you here. Listen, you've written a story for this new horror anthology, Zeegajimo. I don't know how to say this word yet. Zeegajimo. Is that how I'm saying it?
Close. Zeegajimo.
Hey, see? I appreciate you doing that. Thank you so much, man. Do you want to talk? Let's talk about this anthology because the title is Anishinaabemowin. There's no equivalent word in English. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the title means?
Yeah, the title means to tell a scary story, Zeegajimo. And it also, the beauty of the Anishinaabemowin language is that standalone word is also a sentence. It could mean he, she, or they tell a scary story. And this anthology was published by Kagadons Press, Indigenous publisher based in, Anishinaabe territory down in southern Ontario, edited by Nathan Adler and Kateri Akiwenzie-Damm. And it's bringing together some pretty awesome, brilliant storytellers and writers from across Turtle Island to tell scary stories.
Listen, your story, it's called Offerings. It comes at the end of this anthology. Do you want to talk a little bit about where your idea for the story came from?
Yeah, it's based on a creature in some ancient Anishinaabe lore called the Mishipishu. And that figure emerges in various stories, from horror to the more fantastical to even some uplifting. And I think a lot of our figures in our stories embody that spectrum of emotions and experiences and so on. This creature lives in the water. It's a feline. It's a lynx or a panther. It has horns and a long serpentine tail. And it exists in the water world for a number of reasons, partially to protect the water, but also to protect itself and its interests. And in the story I've written, it's sort of a modern take on the Mishipishu stories. And it's kind of like an exploration of the influence of contemporary religion on Indigenous communities and traditionalism as well, and how like that struggle emerges. And then this creature comes in between these two characters. And I won't spoil the rest of it, but it was an opportunity to get a little scary.
I think, I'm interested in that idea of a modern adaptation of a concept that's existed for a while. When you are trying to when you're trying to make that kind of cultural adaptation from stories that have existed for a long time, what do you take into consideration when you try to do that?
Well, I think one major consideration is the key messaging, the moral behind the story. And from an Anishinaabe perspective, we have all kinds of stories featuring all kinds of characters. There's, of course, the trickster figure, Nanabush, that many of us are familiar with. And there are other fantastical creatures like the Mishipishu, like a giant beaver, a giant turtle, and so on. And often these stories inform us about the world around us, how certain things came to be, but also they remind us about how we need to carry ourselves as human beings, both in the natural world around us and amongst our community, right? Yeah. So these different lessons come through different genres naturally, whether it's horror, whether it's comedy, whether it's something that's a little more dramatic. And when you're pulling from these, ancient stories, essentially, I think the challenge is staying true to that original message, but at the same time, offering some more contemporary embellishments or situations and so on. And from my understanding, what I've been raised with, like that's the essence of Anishinaabe storytelling too. You just take the key message or the key moral and you add your own details to it to make it your own kind of story. And I think that's what a lot of writers, a lot of Indigenous writers are able to do when tapping into their culture, their histories and so on, and creating new ways to tell stories that are printed and bound in literature.
My favorite thing about people who write horror is that when you meet them, you cannot tell that they write horror. You know, like that's like you're the most pleasant person on the planet, and you go like, "Whoa, man, this guy's doing a lot of horror." So, but you want to talk a little bit about this because you've been contributing to some more horror anthologies lately. This is not the only one that you've done. What's been drawing you to the horror genre, pal?
Well, I think it's the thrill of being scared. That's essentially at the core of it. I grew up in the 80s with the influence of Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Stephen King stories, and so on, right? And although I haven't been like deeply embedded in the horror world since, it's always been sort of adjacent to me, both in our traditional stories and in some of the popular culture media that I've been attracted to, you know?
Right.
And I think, when you're making yourself vulnerable like that, being willing to be scared, being willing to put yourself mentally into precarious situations, you learn a lot about yourself, I think.
Of course.
And, you can speculate about how you would react to certain situations, how your loved ones may, what you would do for your loved ones if they were in those situations and so on. And I think that's a good thing for all people to do, is just to imagine the possibilities and also recognize the safety of our own privileges too, that we don't have to endure those things sometimes.
I think the other thing about horror is that like there are a lot of comforting and uncomfortable tropes that sort of recur all the time in the genre. The CBC show Unreserved did this incredible episode this week on Indigenous horror. One of the things that the host, Rosanna Deerchild, brought up is that Indigenous artists are correcting some of the tropes that the genre has kind of played up in the past. For one, Indigenous characters are often killed in horror. What are some of the horror tropes that you want to see rewritten?
Well, there's obviously the big one of the Indian burial ground, and Stephen King, although I'm a fan, he, went there too.
I was gonna say, I feel like he did that multiple times.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, get a new trope, bud. Come on. So it's things like that, and that sort of lends itself to the idea of Indigenous erasure, that, the Indians are all dead. Watch where you build your football stadium or else your team will be cursed for generations to come, right? Moving on from that, on a more serious level, like reality, Canadian history, American history has been a horror story for Indigenous people. There has been outright genocide inflicted upon Indigenous nations on these lands. So there's some sad, true traumas and tragedies that we can tap into when writing scary stories. But at the same time, we are being respectful of our people's experiences, our families' experiences, telling them in proper ways, trying not to re-traumatize others and so on. But most importantly, shed a light on what reality has been. And I think that's what all good speculative fiction does, right? And I think horror falls in line with that. When you consider, our reality, our truths, compared to how, the dominant culture engages with horror, that is more of, like the boogeyman is just around the corner, watch out for that closet or whatever. But when you come from a marginalized background, like the boogeyman is all around you, there's ways you survive those horrors already. So I think there's ways to distill that into fiction that can be very effective as a storytelling medium.
So for Zeegajimo, we're talking about people like Richard Van Camp, David Robertson, Karen McBride, truly an all-star lineup. But also, it's really worth noting that it's not just the writers for this anthology who are Indigenous. The editors also are Indigenous. You mentioned Kateri, Akiwenzie-Damm, Nathan Adler, and the press, Kikadon's press, also Indigenous. How do you think working with an all-Indigenous team shaped the perspective on this horror?
Well, I think when you're working with an all-Indigenous team, there are very few explanations you have to do. There are very few barriers in expressing your story and your people's story and so on, right? There's a common understanding of especially that survival of colonialism, but also the day-to-day struggles that a lot of us endure, know? And that's not to say going with a mainstream publisher, they're not going to get that, but maybe some people are less aware of reality than Indigenous people who are working on a project like this. So it was a very organic process from my perspective. It was celebratory too. And, just holding it in my hand right now is a pretty cool thing, right?
It looks so beautiful. But the anthology is Zeegajimo, the writer is Waubgeshig Rice. I appreciate you being here, man. Thank you for your time and congrats on the new project.
Miigwech. Thanks a lot, brother.
Of course, man. Anytime. Waubgeshig Rice is an Anishinaabe author from the Wasauksing First Nation. He's in Sudbury, Ontario. And that is it for the podcast today. Look, if you're listening to this on podcast, give us a follow. We'd really appreciate it. You can find us on YouTube. We're also on Instagram at CommotionCBC. My name is Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. Listen, it's Halloween. Wherever you're doing for Halloween, I hope you have a good and happy and safe Halloween. It's also Diwali, and so I really appreciate that people are celebrating, and I want to say happy Diwali to you. My name is Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion, and I'm going to see you tomorrow.